Hello, welcome. Here's the premise for the video. What if parts are the unconscious subjective simplifications of the whole? What do I mean by this? Well, I mean that every single object you can think of is simply a collection of bounds your mind puts on the outside world. This is evidenced by the fact that you can picture singular objects in your head right now. What I'm getting at here is the distinction between the tree and the air is not a fundamental division of reality itself. It doesn't mean the idea of objects is pointless. It means something to us, but without the mind, there exists nothing to separate the universe. What follows logically is that everything is one in objective reality. There is only one whole, the universe. If this is true, we have not witnessed the beginning of anything, but only the continuation of such. The tree did not begin as a sapling, as there is no relevant distinction. The requirement that things must have a beginning is then a human, baseless concept, and thus the universe is not required to have a beginning. This concept is entirely based on the idea that humans simplify the dimensions of space by creating artificial bounds and criteria on matter and energy. Using this philosophy, let's get some complicated definitions in here. Objects are subjective simplifications of the universe that consist of experientially acquired grouped information within bounds of our senses' limitations. The whole is defined as something that can be absolutely differentiated from the surrounding substance or substances in its entirety. By the way, here's just a gentle reminder that if you find this interesting, to consider subscribing. Anyway, moving on. Now, my objection to this would be as follows. A scientist, excited to disprove this theory, creates a box filled with oxygen, no other molecules except oxygen floating around. Thus, a cube of gaseous oxygen has entered existence. Such did not exist before, and exists nearly exactly as we understand it in the human mind. The object in our head corresponds exactly to reality. Not to mention, such had a beginning, and will have an end in its release. Absolutely incredible, just amazing. A beginning and an end. However, we're looking over a gross asymmetry here. This is not an object being correctly identified in the universe. This is an object being conceived and then orchestrated in its creation. My question is, how could something be of abstract subjective origin and yet hold objective weight on a universal scale? But what about the oxygen box's beginning? It seems to have a clear start and end. However, that again is clearly not a fundamental principle of the universe. There was no objectively meaningful moment that the cube started to exist. Let's define this cube as being only oxygen within these certain parameters, this box. There's two ways to define the cube's beginning and end, containing no oxygen or something other than oxygen within the bounds. So, let's put it into an example. A molecule of another kind is the first to enter the box once it is opened. You mean to tell me that if we put it arbitrarily close to the parameter of the box, then move it that arbitrarily small distance, some universal principle switches from a binary on to off because the object now doesn't exist? It's almost laughable when you put it into such terms. You might think, well, this is obvious. Of course our own interpretations of the universe are subjective, such as objects, and only exist as our subjective projections onto the universe. Well, this was not obvious for a long time. Plato introduced the idea of the theory of forms, which took these objects and placed them on this divine pedestal. Not only that, but Aristotle was involved in the idea of the argument from change, to grossly oversimplify the idea that something had to give way to start all of the change, something like a god. But these ideas presuppose the idea of objects and their significance to the universe. And here I am a few thousand years later telling them how wrong they are. That's why I love philosophy, because you're always wrong enough about something, and it's up to everyone to figure out why. Well, that's it for the video. If you enjoyed it, consider leaving it, well, you know the deal. Just enjoy the rest of your day. You deserve it.